Hey, what's going on? My name is Bim, and this is Final Fantasy 15 on the PC Windows Edition. So I won't be doing a review for this game because it's been out for a while. What I wanted to talk about today is how well it performs on the GTX 1080 and the proper settings you should have. All right, so let's get down to it. So I'm testing everything at 1080p. I am running a 6600K CPU overclocked to about 4.2 gigahertz, running 16 gigabytes of RAM, 2400 hertz. GTX 1080. Originally, it was overclocked to 2103 megahertz, but eventually, and I will tell you why this happened. Eventually, I settled for around 2093 to about 2083 megahertz of an overclock, because I mean PCs are all different. So your PC would be different from mine, and would be different from Brian's and John's and whoever's. But in my experience, I find that the game Final Fantasy 15 does not play well with my overclock. When I turn it off, it's a smoother experience just because there's less flickering and less artifacting, and just generally the frame rates, the minimum and the maximum don't go straying far from each other, you know. So it doesn't work well with overclocking, at least in my experience. But I'm stubborn, so I still will kind of use my overclock and just kind of take the hit, you know. Also, it doesn't work well, at least on my rig. It doesn't work well with NVIDIA's highlights feature. Every time it tries to save something, the game just freezes for like a split second. It's very fast, but it's still very noticeable, and it's kind of annoying because you see everything just freeze for a little bit. So I turned that off. So okay, let's talk about my settings. I have everything set to the highest, except for motion blur, and this is why. Motion blur is, I don't like it. It's a personal preference. I don't like motion blur. What I really tested here were the NVIDIA options. So at 1920 by 1080, your GTX 1080 can handle everything highest settings with all of the NVIDIA options on. Okay, it'll stay for the most part above 60 frames per second. There are sections where it'll dip to below 50, 58, 59. There was even a part, and I couldn't figure out why, because it was like right next to a rock in that open world area where my frame rate was at 50, which is fine. It's completely playable, but if you're kind of like me, you kind of get annoyed every time you dip below 60. So let's talk about the NVIDIA options. So NVIDIA recommends, even on a GTX 1080, to keep Hairworks off. But what I found was Hairworks, at least in my testing, it didn't affect the frame rate too much. It affected it a little bit. So let's go over the results. So an overclocked card of 2093, no NVIDIA options enabled. I was getting a minimum of 60.8 frames per second and an average of about 90 with a maximum of 111.9, which is great. It's smooth, very smooth. This is the open world area. When I turned Hairworks on the same overclock, the minimum was about 65.7, but that's very dependent on what you get in terms of where you are. But I tried to stay in the same area pretty much. The average dipped down to about 88 frames per second, and the maximum that I could get was about 108 only. So very minimal impact for Hairworks. When I turned Hairworks off and then turned VXAO on, the ambient occlusion option, this is where it got pretty bad. My minimum was 58.2. My average was at 78.6 frames per second, and the maximum that I could get was about 97.4. Turn that off, turn turf effects on, which is their geo mapping like option where the rocks become a little more realistic. Everything looks more popped. Minimum was at 55 frames per second. Average was at 78.9 frames per second, and the maximum was about 95.6. So VXAO and Turf Effects have similar effect on the drop of frame rate, and the Hairworks so far it has minimum effect. When I turned on Shadow Libs, which is like a shadow softening option, my minimum was about 48.9, but the average was higher at 83 frames per second with a maximum of about 99. So which is cool. So what I did was I tried to combine options. So I turned Hairworks on and VXAO, and I got an average of about 81.6 frames per second. Hairworks plus Turf Effects, I got 80 frames per second. Hairworks plus Shadow Libs, about 77.3, which isn't too bad. Then I turned on VXAO plus Turf Effects. I was getting about 72.7 frames per second. VXAO plus Shadow Libs, about 81.7 frames per second, which is still pretty good. Turf Effects plus Shadow Libs, 75.3 frames per second. So everything's playable. Everything's completely playable. Everything's buttery smooth. Even if you do dip below 60 sometimes with Hairworks and Shadow Libs on. Then what I did was turned all of my overclock off, and then I turned all NVIDIA options on, and I was still getting about an average of 74 frames per second. So completely playable with all the options on. You will encounter areas where the frame rate will dip, and that's kind of expected, right? For a game as gorgeous as this, for a game as open world and expansive as this, that's going to happen. Alright, so here's what I recommend. First of all, if you're running an overclock, turn it down or either just turn it off. Because if you want a more pleasant experience and you don't want those artifacts or any of those flashing, flickering, you just be better for you to just turn off your overclock or just turn it down. I turned mine down from plus 120 over base clock to about plus 80. So I've gotten rid of most of the flickering. I've gotten rid of most of the artifacts, but it's still there, but it's way less noticeable than it used to be. And as far as the NVIDIA options are concerned, I would recommend they just turn them all off, because you'll barely notice a difference anyway, unless you're really trying to pay attention to them. If I were you, I would pick probably just one option to turn on, probably VXAO, because it makes the lights more vibrant. So I like that. Hairworks you probably won't notice, because unless you're fighting a monster or a beast with a lot of fur, then you won't really see much of a difference like in the open world. Turf Effects is cool, but it's only really noticeable if you turn it on and off and you try to look for the difference. And here's one thing that you should not do while playing this game, and that is to use NVIDIA's screenshots or NVIDIA's Ansel technology, the thing that lets you do 360 shots, the thing that lets you freely move the camera around for screenshots. I'm sure you could use it. You could use it once, and then what happens is the game just completely gets confused. It switches your input from your keyboard to your controller. So every time you have input on your controller, it detects the controller. Then when you stop, it starts detecting the keyboard, which makes the game stutter like crazy. Your frame rate drops to like 11 or 10, which is massively unplayable. That's crazy bad. So if I were you, I would just use the Steam screenshots, which I've tested and that works. And if you've got any other third-party app that lets you take screenshots, maybe you could test that out, see if that works, because for me it doesn't. But apart from that, yeah, turn your overclocks down and turn off those NVIDIA options, and you'd have the best experience. Alright, thank you guys for watching, and I do hope that if you kind of like the video, you give it a thumbs up. And I am chasing for that 1,000 subs, so if you would be so kind as to give me a sub, that'd be fantastic. I upload very seldomly, so I won't bother your feed too much. Alright, thank you guys for watching. Catch you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.